Hi, and welcome to Continuing Education, a podcast for homeschooling families with actually useful information. I'm Heidi, and today we're talking about teaching strategies and skills. If you're new here, this is the kind of episode where we take one research-backed teaching strategy and walk through what it is, why it works, and how we can take that strategy and apply it in our homeschool across various subjects: math, reading, science, history, and life skills, right? Today's skill is concrete examples. This is basically how to use everyday objects, stories, and experiences to make ideas that are really abstract to feel really clear and memorable for your child. So let's start by, what do we mean by concrete examples? The good news is a lot of families do this naturally. This is probably something that as you've kind of taught things, you may have already done a little bit more naturally in helping your kid understand a concept. Concrete examples are specific real-life illustrations that you use to anchor an abstract idea so your child can see it, feel it, and connect it to their own world. So instead of defining a concept only with words, you'll give a picture, an object, or a story that your child can actually touch if they're the hands-on learner, watch if they're a visual learner, or even act out. For example, if you're teaching fractions, this is something that my own kiddo had some struggle with. Instead of just saying something like, fractions are part of a whole, you might say, imagine this brownie pan is one whole pan. If we cut it into 4 equal pieces and I eat one, what part of the pan is that? Now the word fraction is not just a rule on the page or something abstract. It's a piece of a brownie or a slice of pizza or a section of the soccer field, right? Like however you describe it based on their interests. For us, we use pizza actually because my kiddo loves pizza and that was really understandable. And here's how learning scientists put it. The concrete example strategy, quote, involves taking an abstract concept and illustrating it with an example that is more concrete or easier to understand so students can grasp the general idea by first seeing it in a tangible form. Let's talk about why this strategy works, and then we're going to talk about some examples of how you can use it in your daily teaching. So you might be wondering, is this really backed up by research or is it just a cute teaching trick? Research shows that when students can link new concepts to vivid and tangible examples, they understand and remember them better. Concrete examples help the brain translate what kind of is fuzzy language or formulas into mental pictures and experiences, which makes those abstract ideas a lot less intimidating and more relatable. One research-based overview explains that concrete examples, quote, help students understand abstract ideas by first showing them how those ideas look in real, everyday situations, which then supports later generalization to similar problems. Another source notes that when learners can connect a concept to something they've seen or done, the information then becomes easier to retrieve later, especially when they're asked to explain it in their own words, because they have a full grasp of what that means. So whether you're tackling something like a math concept or a historical event, or social emotional skills like empathy, a concrete example can act like a bridge between the concept of like, I don't really get this, it's abstract, you're describing it to me, but I don't quite understand what you're talking about, to, oh, I've actually seen that before. I went to the park and I saw such and such, right? They're seeing it in their actual everyday life. Now, let's talk about how to make this practical for your homeschool day. Here's a simple scriptable routine that you can adapt across grades and subjects. 1, name the abstract idea. So start with something simple and calm. You might say, today we're talking about fractions or empathy or supply and demand, whatever makes sense to you, or not makes sense, but whatever you're covering. What does that word mostly feel like right now? Confusing, boring, or interesting? This tiny question helps you gauge how your child is feeling about the topic, and not just answering for you. It kind of helps them kind of dive into what they're feeling inside. Does it make them nervous that they don't know anything because it's confusing? Is it boring because they have no interest? Or is the phrasing a little bit interesting to them where they're wanting to know a little bit more, and you can kind of capitalize upon that. Now, step 2 is give one clear, concrete example. So let's bring this idea down to the level of everyday life. For math, we could talk about the brownies. Let's pretend mom's brownie pan is one whole. And for this, I recommend you bake brownies. That will make it much more tangible and much more interesting, right? Because they're hoping to have a brownie. if we cut it into 4 equal pieces and I eat one, what part of the pan is that? And then you can actually pull a brownie out of the pan, or if you want, you can draw it on a rectangle on a paper, shade in 1/4. But I would recommend using a real snack to slice up and pull out of the pan so they can visually see it. For social skills, you could, talking about empathy. Empathy is like, you could say, let's see, empathy is like when your friend loses a toy and you say, that must feel really sad. Let's act out a time you lost something and how it felt. So this teaching strategy puts it in a way that's relatable because they're having to think back to a time that they lost something and think about how that makes them feel. And that teaches the concept of empathy. And that can be really helpful for our kiddos who are on the spectrum or who have struggled with those social skills. And then you can, of course, talk about like what made you feel better? What did you do? Or what did someone else do or say to make you feel better? And then you can apply that to someone else and what they can do or say to make that other person feel better. You want to use clear, relatable examples that are close to your kiddos' own experiences so they can quickly connect the new concept to something they already know. That helps them grasp the idea so much faster. The next step is to ask your kid to generate their own example. So you introduced the concept, it asks how they feel, you've basically naming the abstract idea, you've come up with an example, but now let them come up with an example. This helps you gauge whether or not they truly understand this, and it helps you better understand where there may be gaps. So you could follow up with something like, can you think of a time when you use this idea in your own life? Or if they get stuck, you can scaffold around it, right? What if you had half a pizza and your sibling had the other half? What fraction would that be, right? You're not just teaching the concept, you're inviting them to kind of co-create the meaning with you and to walk through an experience, to retrieve some memory from their brain, to craft and create the learning experience in themselves. And then you can connect that back to the main idea. So you can bring it back to the big picture, the big abstract picture. So you could say something like, so what does that example show us about the rule or concept? And then have them say it in their own words, 1 or 2 sentences, write it in a notebook if you want to, put it on a sticky note to keep it nearby to help them remember. And this will echo what researchers note, that when students can explain ideas in their own words using concrete examples, it strengthens both their understanding and their long-term memory. And then this cycle just repeats itself with different examples over time. So the final step is you can revisit the same concept with different contexts. So for fractions, you might talk about, if your kid is into football, you can talk about the fraction of the football field they ran, or if they're into soccer, the fraction of a soccer game played. How long were you in the game? How many minutes? How long is the game in minutes in total? And kind of work it out in terms of a real life example. You could talk about fraction of a book, like, we're really reading through this book and we're on page 200 and there are 400 pages in the book. How much longer do we have to go? And you can even write that out in fraction format to help them better understand that concept. Or fraction of chores done. If they have 5 chores on any given day, they've done 2 of them. What does it mean to be 2/5 of the way through with their chores? So by cycling through the same idea through different examples, you can keep the abstraction anchored in kind of a real life example or hook that your child already understands. So let's take a few moments to talk about some examples across different subjects and how you can imagine this might play out in your own home. So here's just a couple examples I'm going to throw it at you just to get your brain thinking about, where could I use this? A lot of you probably are already using this, which is wonderful, but to kind of just give you some more ideas that you can kind of facilitate in your own home. So math, teach division, for example. You can use a small pile of coins or blocks, and you can divide them into 12, or you can have, something like 12 blocks and then divide them into 3 different piles. So you could say, if we share them equally among 3 people, how many does each person get? Then division is not just a symbol on a page, it's actually like the sharing moment, right? So, or we have a pizza and it has 12 slices and you had 3 friends over, so there's a total of 4 of you. If everybody gets the same amount of pizza, how much do you guys get? And might I recommend you order a pizza that day to actually work through it in a real life example so they can visually see it, touch it, taste it, all of the things. Talking about reading and writing, instead of just defining what a quote unquote theme is, because that's really an abstract word. A lot of kids struggle with talking about themes. You can narrate a short story idea and then ask, what do you think the story is really about? And link it to a concrete experience. So you could say, is this like the time you felt left out at the park? Or pull in another memory from something that they actually did or some experience that they had. This teaching strategy really ties it to a real life experience, can help them find it more meaningful and memorable, but then also can kind of talk about a story and how there's sometimes underlying stories. There's like the actions of what happened in the story, but the theme is actually really kindness or friendship or courage, whatever that story is that you're reading. Themes can be a little bit more difficult for kids, in my opinion. Another one, let's go ahead and talk about science. So when you talk about evaporation, don't just say the word. Set up a small dish of water and a sponge and ask, where do you think the water goes if it's sitting on the counter all day? So you can observe it over time and notice that there's less water at the end of the day or in a couple of days than there is at the beginning of the day. Now evaporation is tied to something that they can actually predict and watch. They probably know the concept, they just don't know the word tied to it. So by walking through this process, you're tying it to something concrete, allowing it to be a visual, allowing them to better understand the concept. Lastly, history and life skills. So when you discuss fairness or democracy, tell a quick story about a family vote, choosing a movie, splitting chores, or deciding who chooses board game that night. Then ask, how is that like democracy? So we do this a lot in our house where we will talk about, actually, I'll give you a perfect example of how we use this. We have a Minecraft realm that we play with other family members. And there are 5, 6, sometimes 7 of us in the game playing across the globe with my kids. And but because it's a realm that we share, we have to have shared rules. And so if we do a raid, for example, we have to decide how are we going to split the resources that we get in the raid when some people are better at the raid and some people are not so good at the raid, or some people are sniping with a bow on the top of something, whereas some people are in the battle. So we have to talk about how we're going to do that, and then we talk through it, and then we vote, right? So that would be a good example of when they're taking something that they're actually doing in real life, which is using democracy or in a shared Minecraft realm, to how they're actually learning what that word is, that they're practicing it, learning what the word is, and then applying it to their learning. So in just a few minutes of talking about that, those ideas become part of your family's go-to strategy in terms of solidifying these concepts. If you're the kind of parent who wants to go a little deeper, here are a few next steps you can explore. First, you can consider adding a concept example journal for each subject. So on the left-hand side of the page, you could write the abstract idea like fractions, empathy, photosynthesis. But on the right side, jot down a teacher-made concrete example and a student-generated example that your child came up with. This allows them to kind of reference back if they need to understand something, but also you can also see how their understanding is growing and how their examples become richer and more flexible as time goes on. Keeping a running list of concrete examples can actually help kids see patterns and build stronger mental models. Second, once a week, you can let your kid be the teacher, where you have to have them, or where you get to have them explain a concept to you using their own examples. This not only reinforces that retrieval practice that we've talked about and self-explanation, but it also gives you a window into how they're thinking about a concept and what they're understanding and what still feels fuzzy. If you'd like to dive even deeper, I recommend 2 resources. I'll put them in the show notes for you. The first is Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. And the other one is Understanding by Design. I'll put both of those in the show notes, so you're welcome to check that out if that's something that you'd like to learn a little bit more about. Concrete examples are one of those strategies that feels simple, but can really transform the way your child experiences learning. And they can turn words on a page into something that they can touch, act out, and remember for beyond just that one lesson. If you're wondering where to begin, I encourage that you pick just one concept this week, maybe a math idea, a reading skill, or a life skill like responsibility, and ask yourself, how can I turn this into a concrete example that my child can see, touch, or live? So thank you for listening to Continuing Education. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with another homeschooling parent and let us know how you're using concrete examples in your home. Until then, keep teaching.